From Uniting the Cults and History Flights Productions. It's The Hidden Faith, a truly independent investigation of the Bahai faith. This time, though, alongside my co-hosts, cannabis and religion researcher Chris Bennett and head moderator of the RX Bahai subreddit, Dale Husband, the Honorable Skeptic, I'll be primarily examining the Fatimiyya Sufi order, a charismatic ayahuasca, DMT, and Halma fueled cult. Though that's not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself, as Chris Bennett will point out, Wahid has multiple misunderstandings of the history of these drugs. Consisting of a dozen people based in Australia and founded by Grand Sheikh Nia Wahid Azal, in order to compare its tactics such as perpetual victimhood and online harassment to that of the shadowy Bahai Internet Agency, minority guardianist Baha'is, and the separately defined power cult of the Universal House of Justice. So why should people care? Deluded old men claim that liberal, scientifically based reasoning itself, as constituted post-enlightenment, is wrong, and call themselves representatives of God, despite benefiting from the intellectual freedom liberalism provides all the time. That liberalism is not exclusive to Europeans either, despite Wahid's attempts to frame skepticism of his divine revelation and well-founded criticism of Hamas's tactics as a white supremacist concept. After all, the American and French revolutions of 1776 and 1789 inspired the Haitian one in 1804, and the struggle for European freedom in World War II was primarily fought with colonized bodies that then gained their country's freedom. To name just a few examples of dozens that show that good ideas like rational rejection of all unfalsifiable claims have no border. Let's see. Just going to be cleaning some dirt off, metaphorically and literally, from me, because this man has decided to make me his mission for some reason. And, well, this is going to be my final takedown of him once and for all. This man should not have any platforms on the internet, and I will explain why very shortly. Another example is that the third leader of the Baha'is, and depending on who you ask, first or only guardian, Shoghi Effendi, who was Oxford educated, did exactly that, including expelling his entire family, declaring homosexuality a mental handicap, despite likely being a self-loathing gay man. Oh, and I just had the volume wheel down. But anyway, and sniffing at his cousin for marrying a, quote, low-born Christian girl. The reason why you should care is that despite Wahid Azal's dismissal of my using these words as colonialism for reasons, Wahid is a delusional sociopath who loves to threaten people in similar ways to that. Not very godly, if you ask me, and thinks he can bring the wrath of God, or rather the police and online platforms, upon anyone, paralleling the tactics of a certain mafioso president who just said that Democrats should enjoy their last Merry Christmas. So, Wahid, I defeated God by casting that old asshole out when my cousin died on 9/11. I defeated him again in the parking lot of American University in freshman year of college after my relationship with someone from the Bahai faith was my final time giving the creaky concept of monotheism a chance. And I have made peace with the atheist accepting all loving God concepts that my wonderful Christian fiance and son in Eswatini, Africa believe in, and that help shape their unconditional love for me. But certainly not your grievance-fueled, wrathful God, Wahid. If you truly are God, I will defeat you once and for all, here and now, for a third and final time. History does not forget, and this channel does stand for truth, justice, and historical accuracy as the wrath of history. You can make whatever shitty ranting response you want to this, but after this, leave me the fuck alone, okay? The good news is, Wahid, that you also played right into my trap by attacking me without a logical basis and became free content, which is the way to handle any trolls, in my opinion. Even crazed wannabe messiah trolls. Perhaps God does exist, and him being an angry, bitter, harassing hermit out of touch with the modern world would explain a lot about how fucked we are as a species right now. God or not, let's begin with Wahid's pathetic response to a portion of my last Hidden Faith script about him entitled, in all caps, for the volume of your post title clearly strengthens your argument. The incoherence of my critics, an analysis of DC Shepherd's Substack post as moral performance, liberal paternalism, and logical collapse. It starts out DC Shepherd is precisely the kind of textbook white liberal racist that I recently wrote about in the first chapter of The Wretched of the Corporate State. He is also an opportunist and time waster from hell. Apparently, my trolling comment on his posts that he deleted in a couple of paragraphs in a 2-hour-long video calling him out for supporting the murder of innocent civilians, including on October 7th, and calling the Bondi Beach shooting an inside job, was enough to get him angry with me. He's doing this to protect Muslims from any criticism whatsoever. And I'm unfortunately blocked from his Substack, so I can't really verify a lot of this, but some of it is on his blog post, which is on his blogspot, excuse me, which is linked throughout. And cannot have me blocked, so that's great. Anyway, so regardless, this is precisely the dehumanizing behavior that I condemned both sides of the Israel-Palestine conflict for perpetuating in the last episode of The Hidden Faith. All that was enough to launch 4,000 words of barely cogent, pseudo-intellectual diatribe, to which I will respond with nearly 6,000 in this actual essay of research and actual original thought. Apparently, Wahid, you're just that unemployed that you can write multiple book-length screeds hardly anyone reads, attacking everyone you can think of, and imagine as part of some worldwide conspiracy against you personally that you've gone to the UN about for some reason. So, yeah. So with that misspelling, he called me an opportunist with nothing but bald assertion. We agreed to work together to take down Justin Baldoni. You're only saying that I'm an opportunist now because, like Chris Bennett said on his latest post of a lengthy 3-part Substack expose that we'll go over in great detail on the podcast portion, you are the opportunist who conned me into liking you and who has a habit of viciously turning on anyone who offers the slightest criticism. I gotta grab this with superhuman strength and put it over here. There we go. That'll be a lot easier reaching that bottom part. Anyway, it's nice to have a calm game like this when I'm talking about subjects that make me angry because this guy just picks me off. But anyway, you also called me a racist, Wahid, with no evidence other than that white people who you think are incorrect can never say anything you don't like. When I never invoked your Iranian identity as a criticism of you. Ever. Doing so to me is in itself a racist twisting of postmodern critical race theory by inappropriately pitting it against liberalism. In general, a common theme of his, without acknowledging divisions such as neoliberalism and democratic socialism, which I personally subscribe to for your personal gain. You also misgendered me again by pretending to, quote, not negate DC Shepherd's trans identity or experiences, to cover your ass while repeatedly using the raw pronouns for me. They, them, theirs, by the way, in case you weren't listening, asshole. And using your race, Iranian, a culturally appropriated and DMT-infused faith when the Bionic website never acknowledges you as, to quote him, as a kind of moral inoculation, a guarantee of progressive legitimacy that preempts critique. That's why I called him a moron. Not because he's Iranian, but because he doesn't understand basic argumentation and human decency, and constantly uses the tu quoque fallacy, or entirely appealing to the speaker's hypocrisy without supporting evidence. I'm not engaging in the same fallacy because I have evidence of your hypocrisy, not innuendo. To continue with this screed, that aside, his Substack post under examination presents itself as a principled intervention in debates surrounding the Bahai faith, Israel, Palestine, and online harassment. Right, forgot that this is how you're supposed to do that. Anyway, it's been a minute since I played Power Wash Simulator 2, so gotta get back to that in the new year. Anyway, Um, yeah, okay. In practice, however, Wahid continues, it functions less as an analysis and more than as a moral performance. Excuse me, one that relies on narrative authority, selective quotation, and the conflation of personal grievance with political critique. The author repeatedly claims allegiance to truth, justice, and historical accuracy, yet the text consistently substitutes these claims with affective escalation, ad hominem framing, and an assumption that moral certitude can be asserted through tone rather than demonstrated through argument. At the structural level, much like Chris Bennett's butthurt ramblings, the post is incoherent. It denounces harassment while engaging it. It rejects ad hominem attacks while centering its narrative on character judgments. It claims neutrality while demanding allegiance to its own interpretive frame. The repeated insistence that critics are morons, deluded, or in need of mental health intervention is not coincidental. Or so Wahid says. Um, it, it, it is the primary argumentative engine. Disagreement is never treated as a difference in evidence, methodology, or interpretation, but as pathology or malice. This move forecloses debate while allowing the author to posture as the sole adult in the room. The A classic feature of what might be called performative liberal rationalism, the belief that one's position is self evidently reasonable, and that dissent must therefore be irrational, extremist, or dangerous. I couldn't have said anything better about you myself, Wahid. Again, the distinction between calling a critic deluded from making a moronic argument and calling someone yeah, um, and a moron for making a moronic argument, too. And calling someone a moron for some immutable protected characteristic is, again, I never attached your ethnicity to anything and have evidence of your insane ramblings against Jews while you repeatedly dismiss me as a white liberal with zero evidence of malfeasance. You basically yelled into a mirror about your own flaws and pretended that it was me. I'll call your belief in your own righteousness performative Abrahamic mystic supremacism. The claim that you have direct insight from your God, obsessed with patrilineal prophetic succession for some reason, and therefore you're above everybody else. Geronimo! Oh, not quite. Geronimo! Anyway, had to be silly there for a second. So I'm almost done, but I'm still trying to find the last little bits of dirt here. And that's what I'm doing with my own conscience by cleaning the last little bits of dirt and anger that I feel towards Wahid Azal. This man has been clinging to the dirty underside of the internet for 30 years, harassing anyone he likes, and I am sick of it and want him gone from the internet. Period. So, the problem is that insights from God are inherently unfalsifiable because he's never conveniently available to answer direct public questions. And therefore, someone claiming infallible authority from God or claiming to be God, from the Pope to the Bahai Universal House of Justice to yourself, can never be held accountable. Europe learned this the hard way during the 30 Years' War, which up until that point was one of the most brutal and wide-ranging wars in the continent's history since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And Enlightenment thought largely sprouted up in that time period because, quote, post-war conditions were highly favorable to new ways of thinking and doing things, building on Greco-Roman rationalism rediscovered during the Renaissance. After the fall of the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire, reintroduced these ideas when its scholars fled the fall of Constantinople in 1453 to the Ottoman Turks, and the printing press made them widely available. Anyway, you posture yourself, Wahid Azal, as the next manifestation of God, an affliction you share with the Bab and Baha'u'llah multiple times throughout your boring, rambling videos, while acting far more viciously towards me than Jesus Christ or Buddha or many other religious figures that have been claimed to be God would probably approve of. You do the same towards your political opponents in the bahai faith with threats of death, which are not new for you. By, quote, skull-fucking in a since-deleted post on Reddit until they, quote, moan into the Aha kingdom, culturally appropriate an entire religion, Azali Babism, aka the Bayani faith, that is so quiet they don't care or can't object, and then act like a know-it-all. I guess God is just a slob like one of us after all, with sloppy logic and violent temper. This posture, he continues, is reinforced by the post handling of private communications. The selective publication of chat logs, explicitly acknowledged as partial, quote, what I was able to save, is presented as transparency, while simultaneously accusing the other party of bad faith and manipulation. This is a textbook example of narrative asymmetry. The author controls the archive, controls the framing, and then imputes intent, obfuscation, fear of retaliation as fact. The result is not evidence, but insinuation. In analytical terms, this collapses the distinction between documentation and storytelling, weaponizing intimacy and context stripping to produce reputational harm under the banner of accountability. Weaponizing intimacy? Where do you get these combinations of words? Idiot. But anyway, the sanctity of private communications should only be broken under grave circumstances. Your threatening of me was one of them. You were the one who deleted your messages, not me, as it is physically impossible for someone to delete someone else's messages on Reddit. Far from your claims of ill intent, I tried very hard for months after the death threats to bend over backwards to keep you comfortable and not angry with me until I simply couldn't take your insidious behavior anymore. You can't delete what you said to avoid accountability for doubling down on threatening your Bahai opponents with death, which is not something new to you, as documented in the script, and is a very serious accusation indeed. So I needed evidence for such and protection from retaliation. And then say that I'm the one selectively cloning. I handled it this way in the first place to prove that you are the one framing the narrative, not me, which proof undermines any claim to fairness or intellectual honesty on your part. I also did it to prove that you actually did say those death threats and threatened to attack me and falsely use reporting systems on YouTube like you did to Dale Husband. If you ever ran to YouTube like the whiner you are, because you ultimately have no argument but calling the police on your opponents. Unfortunately, my picture was very incomplete at first, but then I accidentally rediscovered the messages you deleted in a different screen-recorded archive, and now you can't hide what you've done. There is a difference between critique and sermon. Critique dissects, weighs, and demonstrates. Sermons declaim, condemn, and demand assent. The text under review claims to be the former and says mine is the latter in an endless bleeding of tout pourquoi, but is unmistakably the latter. A performance of certainty masquerading as analysis, a polemic that mistakes insult for evidence, violence for action, and theory for truth. For instance, invectives like white liberal racist and time waster from hell are not critique but character assassination, especially since you have wasted more than enough of my and everyone else's time already. Yet I need to expel you once and for all from my time with this last removal of your argumentative constipation from my system. Next time you respond, you can pretend to have the last word while I just say lol and move on with my life, with my fiance, with my son, with History Flights Productions, which has brought far more value to political, religious, and gaming news conversations than you ever will. To open with an ad hominem is to admit that evidence alone cannot carry the weight. You condemn me for collapsing debate into moral certainty, yet I bring multiple linked sources throughout my script, while yours collapses its own critique into insult before the conversation even begins. The text rails against hypocrisy, but the critique is really the same. It pathologizes dissent, ridicules tone, and reduces disagreement to malice, when I did not do the same. Unless I had the evidence that was clear for all to see, such as your death threats and the trolling Bahai insinuating I was so embittered by my divorce from an emotionally abusive Bahai woman that I would commit domestic terrorism against Baha'is. To condemn ad hominem argumentation while practicing it is not analysis. It is hypocrisy dressed up as theory. But that's been your modus operandi your entire life, Wahid. Refuse to apologize and double and triple down on like the privileged pretend scholar you are. While I have a record, many times, of correcting myself when proven wrong, and as often demonstrated in comments left on my videos, and do not claim academic authority for myself. My attackers are always white men, even if I was a white man and not a non-binary person. Our anecdote inflated into universal truth. You are not immune to criticism just because I'm an American and you're Iranian. And personal encounters do not constitute sociological law. to generalize from a handful of experiences to a sweeping racial axiom. It is sloppy reasoning at best, racial essentialism at worst. It is the very reductionism this essay claims to resist. The essay insists my post is racist because it enacts paternalism, and paternalism is racist because it enacts authority, without a strong disapproval of the logos and ethos of my essay instead of just the pathos. This is mere not tautology, not logic. The conclusion is smuggled into the premise in every paragraph. The argument chases its own tail, mistaking repetition and highfalutin buzzwords for intellectual rigor. Alleged tone policing and seemingly dismissive rhetoric are equated with colonial domination and systemic racism in rhetorical inflation. Not every interpersonal slight is the Nakba. Collapsing all harms into one category is dishonest, a cheap trick to make minor grievances look like world historical oppression. The racial contract framework is wielded like a hammer. Every counterexample is reabsorbed as proof of the system. This makes the claim unfalsifiable, as I experienced in a similar incident last year. While I'm not claiming I've ever acted perfectly, it is if something is immune to contradictory evidence so blithely dismissed as a tool of the West, it is immune to challenge. At that point, it is not an argument but an intellectually dishonest recitation of creed. Mills, Massad, and Fanon are all authors invoked like prophets, yet instead of applying their ideas rigorously, as we'll discuss in more detail, the text waves them around with almost scriptural rhetorical authority to belittle my positions and dismiss the strawman of Wahid Azal's own construction. While these authors are important to study for anyone seriously deconstructing Western-dominated archetypes, your use of them to flatly dismiss my perspective entirely is bare name-dropping, because it doesn't acknowledge criticisms of them that may present flaws in your arguments. This is especially troubling, Wahid, when you repeatedly refuse to acknowledge that I criticized America and Israel's actions multiple times in my original script alongside Hamas's and the Bahai faiths. Anyway, these criticisms include Mills reducing the agency of non-white people under the totalizing maxim of the racial contract, in capital letters. Massad's reduction of gendered and sexual liberation movements in the Arabic-speaking world to mere products, agents, or informants of Western imperialism. And his presumption to make such assertions without having engaged directly with the activists where history is concerned, whilst taking speaking engagements at the controversial American University in Cairo. And Hannah Arendt's criticism of Fanon's theory of violence as a justified tool of liberation in The Wretched of the Earth, shaped by his war experiences, when she stated in On Violence in 1969, quote, "Violence is ruled by means and reasoning. The most probable change it will bring about is the change to a more violent world." Fanon's example is particularly interesting to me because I just watched the kind of overrated but still very fun movie, One Battle After Another, the day after Christmas. I liked the movie alright, mainly due to the excellent action scenes and the nuanced and believable performances coming from Leonardo DiCaprio, Sean Penn, and Benicio del Toro. However, after Licorice Pizza frustrated me in 2021, I came prepared for Paul Thomas Andersonism, such as broad strokes handling of serious themes, for mostly other than the what time is it scenes. Inept comedy that undercuts the sloppily handled and hammered in messages, while OBAA's marginalized characters are often treated as the butt of the joke. Shayna McHale is directed to play Jungle Pussy. Yes, that's her real name in the movie. Spoilers from here on out for One Battle After Another. You've been warned. As a walking cliche, spouting what people who half remembered blaxploitation films, not a dunk on that classic genre of film. I got the Blu-ray of Shaft from Criterion Collection years and years ago, and plan to watch it once I get back home in early January. From college. Think aren't black women should sound like. Teyana Taylor is better as Perfidia Beverly Hills. I swear, who was actually paid to come up with these names? And is the catalyst for the film's plot, but is yet another strong black woman archetype gains her power from acting as a Jezebel towards DiCaprio and Penn. According to the excellent Substack academic Hadassah Race, this is one of the many, quote, controlling images used to, quote, justify exploitation, regulate sexuality, and silence resistance, unquote. Being completely undefined by anything but her sexuality via a stereotype rooted in slavery and rape. Reduces Perfidia to a prop to make Anderson feel like he's an avant-garde director. Just like Wahid uses a hollow solidarity with Palestinians as a prop for his egotistical assumption of the mantle of revolutionary struggle. Chase Infinity is superb as Perfidia's daughter Willa, but is even more of a plot MacGuffin than her mother somehow. The question of her parentage takes up so much of the movie's oxygen and so much of her agency that it smothers the rather silly, ill explained, yet on the nose world build. The evil government faction that parodies MAGA, it worships Santa Claus and opposes race mixing because hardy, fascists are stupid. True, they are, but the Christmas adventurers seats dragged because the belaboring of this one plot point with wooden acting bothered the shit out of my autistic instinct that demands villains have gravitas or internal logic to add nuance to theme. Even if people like Wahid are unlikely to have such in real life. Maybe this will be funnier once Trump is gone as well. Finally, we get to Bobo. A fun coincidence given that that's my Swazi fiance's nickname I have permission to use on air. Uh, and unlike her, is white and non-binary. For the only representation non-binary people get in this film, Bobo cracks in two scenes under interrogation. The only ones, if I recall correctly, where they have any important dialogue, and is the one to give up Willa's secret phone number to the goons. That's incredibly frustrating to me as I've done my best to quietly resist this current American stupidity while non-binary, and yet haven't been able to quit my job at Consumer Financial Protection Bureau while they've been trying to illegally terminate me, illegally destroyed my disability employee resource group, and last but certainly not least, are illegally refusing to request funding from the Federal Reserve, making supporting, let alone traveling to see my family in Africa an ongoing concern. We're far stronger as gender variant people than either Paul Thomas or Anderson or Wahid Azal give us credit, since we've existed for thousands of years in practically every society on Earth. Yet I'm not surprised Paul Thomas Anderson didn't do his homework here, just as Wahid didn't when he hoped to have my supposed white maleness to shadowbox him and eat it too, by claiming to not be minimizing my trans identity. This is the same way Anderson didn't even attempt to address the real life harms of a 25-year-old girl taking a 15-year-old boy when directing Licorice Pizza. Or Wahid couldn't conceive that threatening violence to political opponents online is not only wrong, but counterproductive. When you're that wrapped up in ego, you gain blinders. Anderson just cannot handle nuanced characterization for anyone but middle-aged white guys, just as Wahid apparently cannot conceive of intellectual depth for anyone but himself on the internet. I bring this movie up because the name of the American Resistance Group in OBBA or OBAA, excuse me, I typed that wrong in the script. I need to fix that. French 70 called the French 75 um is a deliberate reference to the same Algerian War of Independence from 1954 to 1962 that Fanon, then dying of leukemia, recounted his participation into his wife in 1961. With another reference being Leonardo DiCaprio's character watching Gilo Pontecorvo. I'm sorry if I butchered that to Italy. And his watching Pontecorvo's 1966 masterpiece docudrama, The Battle of Algiers, which is available for free on YouTube and will be linked in the description and script. Well in Italian with English and Spanish subtitles, as well as HBO Max. On television, I'll have my full thoughts on the latter for the unscripted podcast portion of the video along with Shaft. However, from what I've read, the film shows a very accurate portrayal of the conflict and has been praised as an influence on films from 1984's Red Dawn and subsequently Ukrainian resistance during the 2022 war, to 2006's Children of Men, whose director Alfonso Cuarón said, "The first time I saw this, I swore they were lying when they said everything was fiction." This is a very different, more historically grounded approach to portraying revolutionary conflict on film in my hypothesis than either Fanon takes when stating such heated generalisms as, quote, liberation from colonialism can only be a violent phenomenon that, quote, reeks of red hot cannonballs and bloody knives, and, quote, during the struggle for liberation, this artificial sentinel, the Western morality, is smashed to smithereens. In the face of contravening evidence for the utility of nonviolent struggle in overthrowing authoritarianism, colonial and not, such as the Arab Spring of 2011 and the Gen Z revolution in Nepal. Though even Fanon doesn't call violence an unrestrained good in the article that I cited, or that OBAA takes when mocking rather than explaining the Christmas adventures. To conclude this tangent about the film, I believe that sprawling theories of discursive legitimation, while useful to explain broad political trends, such as Marx with his theory of the alienation of labor that has resonated with me, tend to be shattered into multiple different theories upon contact with actual history, unless confined to a specific historical example, such as Marx's excellent analysis of the early reign of Emperor Napoleon III of France in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. By the end of Wahid's home theory, everything from my tone that was not anywhere near as strident as his, to Unitarian Universalist affiliation, to even private chat logs that I exposed only to report on harassment and hatred as part of a broader expose of Wahid once and for all, so no one is ever tricked into giving this asshat a platform like I was, is folded into a sweeping conspiracy of liberalism, sexual modernity, and lastly, everyone's favorite misunderstood word, Zionism. Use of theory does not account for this, or excuse me, use of the theory that does not account for this becomes a cudgel to silence dissent, rather than a scalpel to clarify complexity if simply restated, as Wahid does to pad his weak, mean-spirited, historically illiterate arguments, rather than examined critically. And thus his theory lies shattered at his feet, as history once again smashes narrative. That's why I started this channel, is to try to use actual history to bust narratives. Whether it's authoritarian narratives in the Bahai faith, or fascistic narratives in America, or the narrative that you have to accept late stage capitalism in order to play video games. And so I implore you to, if you like this and want to hear more from me, subscribe and hit the bell. Doing this stuff for free is hard work that's emotionally draining sometimes, especially when dealing with personal attacks against me, which has rarely happened. But because most people who have criticized me have had good points, and I've been responsive to criticism. But at the same time, there is a limit, and I have to put my foot down. Because you and Wahid Azal are lumping all Jews and Jewish Israelis who do not reject Israel's right to exist entirely into one monolith. The same thing you accuse me of doing to Palestinians, when I, in fact, agree Israel is committing plausible genocide and separated Hamas's genocidal menace from the average Palestinian civilian. One way you did this was by dismissing my experience with losing a family member to terrorism on 9/11 and my sourcing of Yahya Sinwar's blase dismissal of civilian casualties with shrillness about, quote, pinkwashing, when I did nothing of the kind. Then you provide no practical solutions to the conflict, except presumably to let Hamas violently undo the existence of Israel from the river to the sea by justifying rape, kidnapping, and missile launches at civilians from civilian structures, I guess. This is reductionism on steroids, and in fact, what I'll coin the fallacy of grand narrative overreach. When every act is explained by the same master theory to support a predetermined position, thought stops and preaching begins. I guess I shouldn't expect anything different from a self-proclaimed inheritor of an entire desiccated and minuscule faith. In conclusion, the essay, The Incoherence of My Critics, by Wahid Azal, accuses me of collapsing debate into moral certainty, yet it does the exact same thing. Collapsing disagreement into racism, collapsing identity into manipulation, collapsing complexity into the same tortured theory he's tried to peddle to everyone who would listen, with no academics ever citing him, as Chris Bennett mentioned. For my entire lifetime, this so-called response to me is therefore nothing but the pseudo-esoteric, race-baiting, navel-gazing ramblings of a habitual drug user and cult leader, guilty of the many sins it claims to expose. It fetishizes the bahai as a mystical rupture, while mixing it with Marxism and South American drugs, but never explains how that works. And other posts purporting to do so have lacking foundation without bobbies around to confirm. As it engages in empty abstraction, paraded as profundity, it reduces liberalism to a cartoon villain, a straw man built for easy distortion, then drowns itself in jargon such as ontological rupture and hermeneutic sovereignty. These are words that obscure instead of illuminate, providing faux academic camouflage for a man who puffs himself up. While I have never claimed to be more than a history nerd and presenter on YouTube, with historian's instincts, the historian in me, as I put it to him in DMs, did not therefore claim any authority. It pretends to confront colonial violence by parodying theory, but then enacts its own type of violence by refusing to engage with anything, quote, Western. It romanticizes said Occidentalist refusal as resistance, but refusal alone is not liberation. Negation, such as of Israel's right to exist, and America's ideals, or of the value of criticizing infallible, supposedly divinely ordained assumptions, rationally without presenting positive alternatives, is just nihilism when I have criticized both America and Israel plenty. Nihilism that has made you, Wahid, angry enough to threaten harassment because you think nothing matters but your actual opportunism to engage in a performance of radicalism devoid of historical understanding. You made a parade of jargon, a fetish of refusal, a caricature of intellectual power, while being perpetually victimized by the boogeymen of the West, mistaking volume for validity, dogma for analysis, argument for or rather sermon for arguments. I put that wrong. See, I am not perfect. But anyway, like all sermons, it demands faith, not thought. This is what you have always demanded, and this is what I and my co-hosts will talk about today. Your history of having a dangerous and erratic temper is also why I took your threats to, quote, remove my channel by any means necessary seriously and panicked. In my anger, I misunderstood the scope of our podcast agreement and filed a copyright removal request on your copy of the video, after also roiling with anger that you did not respond to my request to take down the video on November 29th. That was a mistake, and I retracted it in response to a counter notification, which I decided on after doing more research on the law surrounding podcast guest releases. For that, I do apologize. But will you ever apologize for dragging my reputation through the mud and saying to me and you two that I claimed your video in bad faith, while you now have the ability to leech off my hard work and be a lazy boil on the side of my achievement forever? No, you will not. For that would require you to do the decent thing and take down the video yourself, for what I have good faith to believe is an infringing use of my trademark over the hidden faith and its logo. Then re-upload it and the thumbnail I made myself that you didn't bother to update when I sent you an updated one. Then re-upload it if you still wish to crib off of me, cropping everything but your face out. In fact, in your latest email, you, quote, reserve the right to respond however you like to, quote, so-called, quote, defamatory statements, misrepresentations, or further escalations, whether online or otherwise. While claiming I could still keep my copy of the video, well, duh, you have no legal leg to stand on to claim otherwise. And that you considered the matter closed when I retracted my claim. So which is it, you shitty asshole? To protect myself from now on, all future podcast guests will not be allowed to have access to the source files without written approval for a limited renewable amount of time, as well as tight restrictions on usage and promotion to prevent this kind of reputational damage happening again. The collaborator feature on YouTube will be sufficient and better enable podcast guests to claim rights to their image anyway, while reserving to myself the right of revocation of such ability for a guest channel to co-host the video through this process by me if they damage my reputation for any reason, unless in response to actual legal process and not the threat of it. As I said in my email responding to you, Wahid, I have plenty of other evidence of your malfeasance through the years towards me and others, and would consider any attempts to abuse reporting systems such as YouTube's copyright claim or other systems a legally servable escalation. You are a public figure. The laws of the United States, the District of Columbia would cover it if you tried anything further. And under U.S. law, any defamation claim would need to prove actual malice, which is not what motivated me to simply ask for more information to corroborate the one source you did provide about Baha'u'llah ordering murders of Azalis, and then criticize you when you responded with venom. False attempts to remove my channel for First Amendment protected speech when I have not been racist to you or anything once would likely result in the termination of your channel. By YouTube, not by me, by YouTube, because they would see for you for what you are, a false reporter. Minus the sexual harassment and adding senile ignorance at best of my pronouns. You're basically a broke, schizophrenic, drugged out Iranian Australian version of Justin Baldoni. See, this is a reference to who you are so people do not assume you're white like Justin Baldoni, not an homonym. And this video is the first time I've ever mentioned it, so don't hide behind it ever again. Just like Baldoni, you initially presented yourself as a fighter for justice, but turned on on your collaborator the moment he didn't smile and nod and go along with everything you said. So your crazy ramblings at least likely won't lead to lawsuits, despite empty legal threats and harassment being a favorite of yours for decades.
From Uniting the Cults and History Flights Productions, it's The Hidden Faith, a truly independent investigation of the Bahai faith. I'm here today with Dale Husband, the Honorable Skeptic and moderator of RX Bahai, and Chris Bennett, religion and cannabis researcher. We're here today to discuss the hyphen Bahai faith, the Fatimiyya Sufi order, as expressed mainly, though not exclusively, through the person of Wahid Azal, cult leader, and Guardianist Baha'is. Why don't we kick it off? Yes, so I have written a few in response to Wahid. Have I done a good job in the past few episodes of The Hidden if you've managed to see that? If not, that's okay.
Yeah, I think you do a pretty good job. As for me, I tend to be more of a writer than a speaker. So I can spend hours working on my blog, writing in considerable detail and providing evidence for everything that I write about for the sake of credibility. So you just have to make sure that everything you talk about, everything you write about is backed up by credible evidence.
Yeah, even though I insulted Wahid at times, I think that that was well-founded by his behavior. I think that Wahid is the better writer on high theory and Sufi religious background because he has experience with that, but he is very insular. He tends to preach to the converted, if you know what I mean. And he seems to have quite a few, at least subscribers, who are at least a little interested in what he has to say on, say, translating the writings of the Bab, which is a scholarly contribution that he's made. So he's not stupid. He's just stubborn.
I thought he was gendered. Yeah, that was just not cool. You know, he claims to be this big leftist, and right off the bat then he's always continually trying to pin Zionism on people. I'm definitely against Israel and what's happening in Gaza and stuff like that, but I think that there's a rabidness to his that breaches over into anti-Semitism, the way that he hurls you were for a two-state solution that would be offensive to him, you know?
Yeah, which I am for, by the way, because that's been the only practical solution since 1947. Do I like Israel's actions? No, but I don't want innocent people to die either on either side, and hate both leaderships because I have expressed many times, after doing much careful research and much reflection and evolving in my positions as a result, that both Hamas and the Israeli government are committing genocide to varying degrees.
Netanyahu got Hamas started. There was a lot of funding that came from Netanyahu. This is a well-known fact. You can just Google.
It used to be a charity, too.
To foil talks with the Palestinian Authority about two-state solutions. I think the two-state solution is one thing, but I think Alain Pape may be onto something too with one secular state, you know? That might be a solution there as well.
That's basically Belgium. They have the French sector, the German sector, and then the Walloon sector. And that works well because there's a history of parliamentary democracy there. There's not so much in the Middle East, which is often has states represented by Sharia law. I have a problem with that because it decides that human rights are subservient to Islam. I don't necessarily think that democracies have to copy the exact Western structures, but as long as the people get a vote, I don't really care. And Israel, the people do vote. There are Arab Israelis who vote for parties and have a dual identity in that regard. Speaking of Islamic or post-Islamic, he names himself a grand sheikh of a Sufi order, yet he's also a Bab? That makes no sense to me.
Yeah,
Well,
I don't know about that either. That's
well,
pretty wild.
let me put it this way. As I see it, the Muslims, especially in the Middle East where Islam originated, seem to be in the state of the same spiritual state that Christians of Europe were in about 1,000 years ago. And just as it took Christians of Europe from about 1500 to 1800 to move through a period of enlightenment in which they were no longer ruled with absolute power by kings and emperors who used the church to keep the lower classes in line, known as feudalism. Okay, Muslims are still stuck in their own brand of feudalism with kings, ruling over most of the Middle East, with a few exceptions. And so it's going to take a long time for Islam to become the Islamic peoples of the Middle East and Southeast Asia to become more secularized. But I do believe that will inevitably happen over time as more and more people become more exposed to different points of view via the internet.
A lot of Islamic people I know here in Canada is full of Islamic people. Most of them are very well educated. Wahid as well, he's very well educated. There's definitely the situation there of the politics. Iran was actually pretty liberal before the Iranian Revolution, and a lot of that happened because of the United States. If anything, I think the United States has exacerbated problems in the Middle East.
Oh, absolutely.
Life a lot worse for people there.
That's why I don't want them bombing Iran right now for the protesters. A few points as well. One, feudalism still exists on the island of Sark. It's much more for the tourists these days, but there is still a lord who technically governs. Two, it then makes it hypocritical that Wahid is so rabidly anti-Western because he received a Western education. Not that he's obligated to have any position, but at least follow the scholarly conventions such as, I don't know, citing your sources. Three, it's interesting, Dale, that you mentioned enlightenment, because that was one of my points in my initial video attacking Wahid, The Madness of King Wahid Part 1, because I said, well, he tries to frame enlightenment values as exclusively a European thing. It may have started in Europe as a response to the 30 Years' War, which was the last major brutal war based on religion, to my knowledge, that Europe went through, and established the idea of Westphalian sovereignty to begin with. But these are universal ideals that have been picked up by revolutionaries and applied everywhere. Once people started to get the idea of freedom, and once it was successful in America and France, people kept trying. I mean, the entire reason for the Bab existing and getting a following was because that was a period in the mid-19th century in America with the Mormons and elsewhere in the Great Burning In period and other places of people deciding to try to apply more rationality to religion. I still think it's very presentist for the time, and the Bahai faith in particular falls down on a number of scientific topics, including the acceptability of homosexuality and the naturalness of it.
One of my biggest influences in making me leave the Bahai faith after I'd been a member for about 8 years or so were the writings of George Orwell, in particular his novels 1984 and Animal Farm. In fact, George Orwell wrote Animal Farm as a specific critique of the Soviet Union under the leadership of Joseph Stalin.
Right.
Stalin had started out as a middle-level member of the Communist Party. He soon became the general secretary of the Communist Party, and after Lenin passed, he basically maneuvered himself into supreme power over the Communist Party. And then over the next, 20, 30 years, he basically did everything but be a communist afterwards. He ruled the Soviet Union, even though technically it had a socialist economy, he actually ruled like a total fascist. And he actually killed more of his own people than his contemporary dictator Adolf Hitler killed of Jews and others during the Holocaust of World War II. So in some respects, Joseph Stalin was an even worse dictator than Hitler.
In some respects, yes.
General thing is, I've noticed about Wahid Azal is that he basically attacks anything Western, anything liberal, including so far as to bash the Unitarian Universalist Association, which I'm a member of.
So am I, so that makes me sick.
And to me, the fact that he does that, even though UUs have never said anything particularly against his beliefs. In fact, UUs are very accepting of diverse religious beliefs like Islam, Christianity, Judaism, paganism, and so forth. The reason he bashes Unitarian Universalism is because just like Joseph Stalin, he has this authoritarian mindset. He's basically a narcissist. And when you are a sociopathic narcissist, you're either the leader, having followers that follow you, or you have enemies. There's no standing equals with anyone with someone like that.
Did he
Joseph
reveal
Stalin-
himself as a living mirror to you there, Dale? Or did you figure it out along the way?
What do you say?
Did he reveal himself as the living mirror to you?
Oh, that nuttiness.
Did you figure it out along the way yourself?
Not really. He didn't say anything specifically to me about that. But I later did find out through listening to one of his podcasts that he explicitly claimed to be a manifestation of God.
Yep.
With, in other words, putting himself on the same level as Baha'u'llah, who he considers to be like the ultimate cult leader. And he himself is a cultist too.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting because when I was watching the video of DC Separate and Wahid Azal together about 10 months ago, was it?
Yeah, approximately.
It was very hard for me to watch because I had a sense of deja vu.
I should have listened to you.
Because he and I, Wahid Azal and I, had done a similar project about 6 years ago. And even when I was watching DC Separate and Wahid Azal together, in the back of my mind, I thought, within a year, those two are going to be enemies.
Yeah.
I was proven right.
To your point, I really tried not to be his enemy for as long as I could, because he said, well, if you disavow me, I'll disavow you right back, and I didn't want that smoke. But eventually, the breaking point came when he accused me of being for the state of Israel's actions simply because I wasn't willing to write off October 7th, the murder, rape, and kidnapping of innocent people as the cost of revolution. As I just argued in a video essay I just did reviewing Avatar, Fire and Ash, nonviolence should be the main thing and violence should be a last resort because nonviolent revolutions have worked. To your point about authoritarianism and Animal Farm, Dale, did you see the 2026 Animal Farm trailer?
No, I don't think so.
Good. It looks terrible. It's an animated adaptation for kids, which George Orwell explicitly did not want. Trying to sausage party-ify, if you know that movie, Animal Farm, by making it more of a comedy with Seth Rogen as Napoleon. And Out of Touch Elite playing an Out of Touch Elite makes sense, since he said, oh, the 15th time you get your car jacked into, you might get a little knife as a present. Like, I like his movies, but he can be such a stoner in, like, the worst way possible, if that makes any sense. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with that, and we'll get to entheogenic stuff, because the main thing I want to talk about relating to Chris Bennett is the psychedelic fatwa controversy. Do you want to kick it off, Chris?
Okay.
I've been part of the plant medicine, cannabis legalization scene for a few decades, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Wahid came in strong in the around 2014, 2015 with this claim of fatwa from an Ayatollah in Iran that he said he almost endorsed psychedelics, but said they were permitted, right? That's how I kind of got to know him. Now, after he ran into a conflict, I kind of went back and looked at that. I could not find any, Iranian news stories about it, anything from the Mideast about it. And I'm familiar with similar fatwas regarding cannabis because cannabis, like the psychedelics, aren't specifically referenced in the Quran prohibitions of alcohol. And I think opium is also more specifically identified even in the Quran. And so there was a lot of debates about it through the Islamic medieval period forward, whether it was permitted or forbidden. Some people argued, well, it's not explicitly forbidden in the Quran, so it's permitted. But other people argued, well, it gets you intoxicated like wine, so therefore it's forbidden. The legalization or the permission of cannabis varied from place to place and over time in various regions. In fact, I think in Iran, it wasn't explicitly prohibited until the 60s or something like that.
Wow.
So there was a lot of discussion, a lot of, like the prohibition of cannabis in the Islamic world as well as India, is, leftover stuff from European influences, britishraj in India, right? This is directly where the cannabis prohibitions, then later with UN treaties and stuff like that as well, forced prohibition of cannabis in other places in the world too, like Nepal. And all the fatwa is saying is, well, they don't specifically mention these plants in the Quran, and Muhammad doesn't specifically mention them, so they're not prohibited. They're not explicitly prohibited. All the stuff about psychedelics and mind expansion, stuff like that, it's not clear that the Ayatollah ever really addressed any of that.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned the Raj, because as a closing statement for my Avatar essay, I drew upon the Nonviolent Revolution by Gandhi, even though he was a creep to his great nieces, that helped end the British Raj in the first place, as opposed to the failed Indian Rebellion of 1857, where poor Bahadur Shah II, Zafar, he was the last Mughal emperor who basically just ruled the city of Delhi because his ancestors had been puppets of the Marathas for a long time, and the British were like, okay, we'll let you keep your pretty palace if you let us collect taxes. And then he was reluctantly roped into war. He tried to have his son be the commander of the army, but he was terrible, so he just sat back and hoped for the best and was a symbolic figurehead. But Bengal dropped out of the war because they didn't want to be ruled by an Islamic dynasty again, which was what the Mughals were. But then when he was overthrown, he just had a quiet life, writing awesome poetry like, "Then the sword of Hindustan shall flash before the throne of London," which goes so hard, in my opinion. It's funny, too, that Islam is so authoritarian. I've been wondering about this for a project that I'm doing about the Byzantine Empire and its interactions with Islam, called The Empire of Many Lives, that will be multiple video essays over several months. I think that it probably was just the idea of loose, disparate tribes being united by one leader that led to authoritarianism in the first place, and the natural succession disputes of having religion intertwined with power.
Yeah, I think that's true of all religions, not just Islam.
Oh yeah, no. I was specifically speaking out of the context there. And again, it's interesting that he tries to claim authority over the Babi faith when I could never find any mention of him on bionic.com. Well, I thought about reaching out to them, but they probably don't even respond to emails much anymore, because there may be a few hundred people who are all living in silence.
Yeah, I doubt they even know who he is.
Exactly my point. He keeps trying to claim authority in places that he's not an expert in, as well as places he's an expert in.
He's going to take me to the United Nations court on
what?
behalf of
I thought that United Nations thing was just about the Baha'is. That he was just like, oh, the Baha'is are discriminating against me because they kicked me out per their rules, I guess.
Yeah, he has an article where he's bringing it up against me in Cannabis Culture magazine. He wrote 20 articles about me.
Oh, right. Yes, I did cover that in my big presentation that I made for Rami Rustam because, well, I can understand Rami's position. The controversy threatened to swallow United in the Cults in general, and I think he and his experiences with Wahid on his podcast, which it would be nice if that got taken down, but I don't expect it. I don't even expect Wahid to respond to my demands to take down my real name because he weaponizes that kind of shit all the time, unless legal process stops him. But yeah, so I can understand Rami's position that he didn't want to get caught up in a bunch of infighting, but I laid out all my evidence, and he let me continue on with uniting the cults. And after this episode, I will be comparing the Baha'i faith to other cults instead, like the people helping people pyramid scheme that I've been doing research into for about a year. This is how cults work. They offer you nice food and nice people as bait. That's exactly what happened with the Baha'is too. I got lulled in by exactly. I got lulled in by Nahru's food by a cute girl who really her mission was to at least get me interested in going to this group, because that is the pretextual mission of every Baha'i, unless proven otherwise, in my opinion, is to push that on you. Like LGBTQ Baha'i Experience, he's very inactive in the administration, it seems, and he and I just have nice discussions. Like, he's not trying to convert me. I'm sure Baha'is like him are out there, but they've been silenced by the administration. I wouldn't be so mad at their stances against commenting on politics, for instance, if they didn't prohibit their members from doing so. That is authoritarian. And if you do, then you get administrative sanctions, such as loss of ability to get married, which you have to do the stupid vow for, and I only signed it because it was the moments after my wedding, and my ex-wife's mom had lied about being okay with the altered vow, but seemed very anxious that I should just do that, so I put on a face and compromised my integrity. I take oaths very seriously. I have had an oath to the Constitution and to the people of the United States of America. And in that oath, I have been criticizing our domestic enemies in the Trump administration and this fascist regime. So to be compromising myself like that, it bubbled up for a long time. And so I guess I fearlessly criticize people now because, and sometimes get a little purple with my language because, or florid, because I've been silenced for so long. I've had my autism silenced, I've had my gender identity silenced, and attacked in person. That part was particularly hard to rewatch for the essay that I just uploaded after all these hours of editing. And my mask is a mask of, like, protection for me. The Baha'is mask with a smile. Wahid masks with a kindly old bearded Santa Claus image, I guess, at first, until he has no use for you. And then you get disposed of. He treats people like garbage, including the guy who...
I think I already mentioned some time ago, Wahid and I first made contact when he made a comment on my WordPress blog, Dale Husband's Intellectual Rants, and he invited me to join a website called Iranian.com. And he said that because I was not Persian, or let alone Iranian, I would not be viewed with suspicion by any Baha'is there if I tried to argue against the Baha'i faith there. So I went there, I formed an account on this website, and for a while, Wahid and I were like brothers in arms battling against these Baha'is. And I was really disappointed in how shallow-minded some of these Baha'is seem, because they seem content only to quote from their scriptures and their published propaganda, instead of even trying to think creatively for themselves. And watching all these evil attempts to argue back against my own essays critical of the Baha'i faith really shocked me, because when I myself was a Baha'i for about 8 years, I was regarded as highly knowledgeable by other Baha'is. But that proved to be a double-edged sword in that in the last year of my being a Baha'i, I started to subject the Baha'i faith to the same sort of critical analysis I subjected to Christianity. And when I did, within a few months, the credibility of the Baha'i faith fell completely apart for me. And so I left it. And then after we had got done with Iranian.com, we both ended up on Reddit together, me and Wahid Azal. And I joined r/ex-Baha'i as a regular member. And at the time, the only mod there was a person known as Salman Wilson. He was the only one there, and he wasn't there very often. And so very often, the ex-Baha'i subreddit would be invaded by Baha'i, particularly this particularly obnoxious Baha'i known to us as David Ben-On, or DBO for short. He would come in, he would raise a lot of hell for a few weeks or months, and then come back and raise more hell. He did this repeatedly. And Wahid Azal and I and many others had to deal with the brunt of this. Salman Wilson wasn't seeming to do anything about it until he finally appointed 2 more mods to try to keep a better watch over the subreddit. And shortly after that, David Ben-On was finally banned. Azal went off the deep end and started making all sorts of claims about how the subreddit was supposedly run behind the scenes by this wicked cabal, which involved the Baha'i. He had no reason to make these claims. And because he had no support for them, we all figured out that he was a pathological liar. And he finally got banned for his abusive behavior. And after he got banned, he turned on me because I refused to support him anymore. And he started making up all sorts of outright lies about me, taking things that I had written about serious ethical issues that I've been extremely concerned about, including politics, religion, sexuality, and so forth, trying to depict me as something I absolutely was not. And that made me understand that this was a person with absolutely no sense of morals whatsoever. He was a sociopath, an opportunist, a narcissist. And a person like that, in my opinion, should have absolutely no access to the internet, because all he ever does is cause trouble. He does not so much care about criticizing the Baha'i faith as he wants to promote himself and only himself as much as he can. If you're not willing to be his blind, deaf, and dumb follower, he will seek to destroy you, because his ego is too fragile to stand as an equal with anyone else. And that's a very dangerous, like I said, the case of Joseph Stalin is, an example of a leader who uses communism to climb to the top and then seeks to tear down everyone else.
That's pretty good analysis, man. My experience was I did a podcast with him, but he took it down. I liked him at first. I thought he was a really great source of knowledge on Iranian mysticism and stuff like that. The only reason I ever even found out about the Baha'i and all this Bab stuff was because of him. They weren't even on my radar at all before I had even come into contact. And then I started to kind of get little ideas like there's something going on here with this guy and this religion here. I think it's a fascinating story. For one thing, his whole battling with the Baha'i and at university about their authoritarian role against Baha'i academic students. He was probably on his way to a good academic career back then, but then it all got sabotaged by this big email group controversy that happened back then. In retaliation, he started finding out about the Bab and then, made these interesting claims about being the modern successor of the Bab and overruling the Abalahu. It's a fascinating tale, that's for sure.
Let me put it this way, as I see it. The credibility of the Bab as a religious leader should have ended the moment he was killed in 1850, because his claim was to be the Mahdi, or the coming of the 12th Imam, who was to overthrow the enemies of Islam. The simple fact that he was killed should have ended that. But the problem was the Babis that survived had the sunk cost fallacy, in which you sacrifice so much for yourself. And of course, the Bab himself sacrificed his life. Therefore, the cause still had to be upheld no matter what. And I think the early Christians were also like this too. Even to this day, Christians say that Jesus died for us, therefore we must live for him. So likewise, the Babis, and later the Bahai, said that the Bab had died for us, therefore we must live for this cause we still believe in.
We have about 2 minutes left, so I'd like to make my final statement and then we'll wrap. Okay, so this also happened to the Seventh-day Adventists in 1844 when the promised biblical calendar date did not come. Women and children were gathering their cows and putting heavenly robes on them so their children would have milk in heaven. That's hilarious to me. I only learned about this fact from A Thief in the Night, though, because they were trying to discredit the Seventh-day Adventists and promote the Baha'is. I thought that this was just a neutral book on the phenomenon that a girl I was interested in was giving me, but no, it was a piece of propaganda. Wahid Azal's reign of terror ends now. I will not let him hurt anyone else by tricking them into thinking that he's a good guy who just wants to hear them out. And that's what the mission of the Hidden Faith is: to expose authoritarianism in all its forms. So thank you all for coming on.
Thank you very much.
Okay, cheers.
All right, have a good one.
You bet. Bye.
So, to absolutely no one's surprise, Wahid Azal has attempted to once again silence this video by filing a claim before the Copyright Claims Board via their ECCB process as laid out by the Copyright Alternative in Small Claims Enforcement Act of 2020, also known as the CASE Act, that was signed into law on December 27, 2020. I will be filing a custom protective order in an attempt to seal my real name being used in this case because it's part of a pattern of him threatening my online safety. But I also look forward to the 60-day period ending on April 1st. He should have filed it on April Fool's Day, but this is close enough for me. At which point, I will respond with a Section 512F misrepresentation claim. And that's why I've also uploaded this video in order to present the whole story without any kind of thumbnail that he could claim is infringing. And then make sure he can't do this again, because if he loses, he has to pay me money. And he also can not do the same thing to other people for 12 months. Because it's an abuse of legal process, which is illegal. In any case, time for me to finish this job that started it all a little over a month ago. Because in that time, I have responded to more unhinged essays than I would like. But I simply cannot let an ignoramus get away with misrepresenting history, either my own or that of the Soviet Union's, i.e. misrepresenting his own malfeasance, but also the malfeasance of the Soviets, which I will acknowledge where they are a country that has brought good to the world, such as in engineering and arts, but a lot of that even is tainted by the explicit purpose of the state to censor the arts. And that's what Wahid is doing here with his claim. Because he has said in a public filing that, let me see, in what I call the Sistine Chapel of federal case filings, he has stated that he has the sole copyright to the photograph, which he has not proven because, well, he could have consented to have that reproduced by any number of news sites. And, well, they own the copyright to a picture that you freely give them. So that cannot be used as a blanket copyright thing because, well, all this really is a useless waste of time. But anyway, he says that he was harmed by the reputational and dignitary harm, as my image was associated with content and commentary I did not endorse and would not have consented to. No one consents to journalistic commentary entirely. You can not consent to comment on the record, but that's about it. If you are a public figure, then your public statements are on the record. And that's exactly what happened here, is I have characterized and analyzed your public statements, Wahid. Not consenting to be criticized for your public behavior does not mean that you have copyright over that commentary, over any use of your image, including surrounded by my video elements. And so, Wahid, you have a choice to make. Either withdraw this entire stupid filing, or prepare for a knockdown, drag-out fight. Because, again, I will be going to the board with a letter notifying them of bad faith intent in order to conference and hope to dismiss this as soon as possible. So really, you're just delaying the inevitable unmasking. And in fact, that isn't even working because, as people can see, my original essay is right at the beginning of the video. So there will be no doubt that you are going to face a reckoning, Wahid. But it is not engineered maliciously by me. I am simply a reporter adhering to truth, justice, and historical accuracy as best I can. I make mistakes, and I acknowledge them. But I have good intent, and that is to expose your behavior that has been going on for almost as long as I've been alive, so that reasonable people who see it can make their own decisions. So either apologize for all of the harm that you've done to me and to others, or prepare to have that criticism continue. If you don't want to be criticized, then stop doing derisible things. If you don't want to be called a fascist, in an analogy where the ICE director was called that, that does not mean that I'm calling you a fascist, necessarily. I'm sorry, I'm tripping over my words. This is unedited and raw because I am just so done. Just done with this guy and his harassment and his abuse of legal process and his obsession with having the last word in every conversation. Even if he's incorrect, he can never shut up, even years later. Harassing my co-contributor, Dave? Sorry. Dale. Excuse me, Dale, I got your name wrong because that's how freaking angry I am about all this. Anyway, I'm saying this because I believe it with my whole heart to be the truth. You will lose. And either process or time will prove that out. So fuck you. You cannot defeat me. Because no one throughout my entire 33, almost 34-year journey has ever managed to really get me down for long. Now, again, where I have committed a wrong, I do my best to rectify that. Because that's what it means to be an honest person. It doesn't mean that you are correct all the time. It means that you strive to do your best every day. And that's what I have done. So, I hope that if you have gotten to this point, you can all give this video a like, subscribe to me, share it everywhere, to let Wahid know that the truth is irrepressible. That cover-ups are worse than crimes. And that copyright is not a hammer to be used to protect against perceived reputational harm. You all have a good one.